What if human consciousness didn't evolve forward, but collapsed inward? What if everything you've been taught about history, awareness, and reality was only a controlled fragment of something far greater? Stay with me, because by the end of this video, you may realize that awakening was never lost, only delayed. Before recorded history became fragmented into dates, rulers, and wars, ancient traditions describe a radically different human condition. This was not a time of technological superiority, but of perceptual depth. Humanity, according to early myths and esoteric records, once experienced reality as an interconnected whole, rather than a collection of separate objects and identities. Consciousness was not confined to the individual mind. It was understood as something participatory, something that flowed between humans, nature, and the cosmos. In this original state, knowledge was not accumulated through institutions or authority figures. It was accessed through direct perception. Intuition was not considered mystical or unreliable. It was the primary interface with reality. Humans did not interpret the world through rigid belief systems. They experienced it. Thought, emotion, and perception operated in harmony, without the internal conflicts that define modern psychology. Ancient cultures symbolized this era as a golden age, not because life was easy, but because awareness was expansive. Time was not experienced as pressure or scarcity. The present moment carried depth, memory, and meaning. Death was not feared in the modern sense because existence was not perceived as isolated or finite. Identity was fluid, relational, and deeply embedded in the environment. Crucially, there was no strict division between the sacred and the ordinary. Daily life itself was a form of participation in a larger cosmic order. This is why early spiritual traditions lacked dogma. There was nothing to enforce. Truth was self-evident through perception. This state did not disappear suddenly. It began to erode, and the erosion did not start with violence or catastrophe, but with redefinition. Something shifted in how humans were taught to understand themselves. The transformation of human consciousness did not arrive as a dramatic collapse. There was no single disaster, no global destruction that announced the change. Instead, ancient sources describe something far more subtle, and therefore far more dangerous: a gradual narrowing of awareness. Humanity did not lose consciousness. It lost range. Perception became focused, selective, and eventually confined. This narrowing began with language and symbolism. Early humans did not use language to define reality, but to point toward it. Words were reminders, not replacements for experience. Over time, however, symbols hardened. Words stopped pointing and began substituting. Reality was no longer encountered directly. It was interpreted through descriptions, rules, and narratives. This marked a profound shift. When description replaces perception, experience becomes secondary to belief. Alongside this change came the introduction of hierarchy. Certain individuals or groups began to claim exclusive access to truth. Knowledge, once something discovered inwardly, became something distributed outwardly. Humans were taught that understanding required mediation. Priests, kings, and later institutions positioned themselves as necessary filters between individuals and reality itself. As awareness narrowed, intuition was reclassified as unreliable. Direct inner knowing was reframed as dangerous, chaotic, or sinful. In its place, obedience was promoted as virtue. Order replaced understanding. Predictability replaced depth. What was lost was not intelligence, but the ability to perceive beyond conditioned frameworks. Ancient myths encode this shift symbolically. Stories of a fall, an expulsion, or a descent appear across cultures. These narratives are often misread as moral tales. In reality, they describe a psychological event, the transition from participatory consciousness to observer consciousness. Humanity began to see itself as separate from the world, rather than embedded within it. This separation altered everything. Nature became an object instead of a relationship. Time became linear instead of cyclical. Identity became fixed instead of fluid. Awareness, once expansive, became localized inside the skull. And with that localization came vulnerability, because a mind cut off from its wider field becomes easy to guide, easy to frighten, and easy to control. The narrowing was not imposed overnight. It was taught, normalized, and eventually inherited. And once inherited, it felt natural. As human awareness continued to narrow, a critical transformation took place. Authority moved from the inside to the outside. In the earlier state of consciousness, guidance emerged from perception itself. Decisions were informed by intuition, observation, and an embedded sense of balance with the surrounding world. There was no need for imposed rules, because understanding preceded action. When awareness diminished, however, this internal compass weakened, and something rushed in to replace it. External authority arose not as tyranny but as reassurance. Ancient societies began to look outward for certainty. Leaders, priests, and lawgivers claimed the role of interpreters of reality. They did not present themselves as controllers, but as protectors, those who knew what others could not. This distinction is crucial. Control imposed by force invites resistance. Control framed as guidance invites submission. With this shift came the sacralization of hierarchy. Power was no longer questioned. It was sanctified. To disobey authority was not merely social rebellion. It became spiritual transgression. This was one of the most effective psychological transformations in human history. Obedience ceased to feel external and began to feel moral. Ancient texts reveal that authority figures did not simply enforce behavior. They reshaped perception. They defined what was real, what was possible, and what was forbidden to know. Knowledge became compartmentalized. Certain truths were reserved for elites, initiates, or the divine realm. The majority were taught to trust, not to see. This reorientation altered the human relationship with truth itself. Truth was no longer something experienced. It was something declared. Once declared, it became rigid. Questioning was reframed as danger. Curiosity became suspicion. Over generations, humans internalized the idea that insight must come from outside themselves. The result was dependence. A consciousness accustomed to external authority forgets how to navigate uncertainty. It seeks structure even when structure obscures reality. This dependence did not eliminate awareness, but it redirected it. Humans learned to look upward instead of inward, backward instead of present, and outward instead of within. Authority did not destroy consciousness. It replaced it, and replacement, unlike destruction, leaves no obvious wound, only absence. When internal authority weakened and external authority took its place, a new mechanism became necessary to preserve the emerging order. That mechanism was fear. Fear was not introduced violently or suddenly. It was cultivated carefully, framed as protection rather than control. Ancient texts describe a shift in which humans were taught that the world was inherently dangerous, unpredictable, and hostile to their existence. Fear changed the function of the mind. A fearful consciousness does not explore. It defends. It narrows perception to immediate threats and rewards. This is not philosophical speculation. It is a neurological fact. Fear reduces complexity. It simplifies reality. And a simplified reality is easier to manage. Once fear became normalized, humans no longer needed constant enforcement. They internalized boundaries. They began to regulate themselves. Rituals, taboos, and prohibitions multiplied, not as expressions of wisdom, but as containment systems. What had once been intuitive balance became behavioral compliance. This transformation altered the emotional landscape of humanity. Anxiety replaced curiosity. Guilt replaced reflection. Shame replaced insight. Ancient myths began to describe humanity as fallen, flawed, or inherently sinful. These narratives were not about moral decay. They were psychological conditioning tools. A being that believes itself broken will seek correction from outside. Fear also reshaped the idea of the divine. The sacred was no longer experienced as presence, but as judgment. Instead of communion, there was surveillance. Instead of participation, there was obedience. This inversion severed the direct relationship between consciousness and reality. Fear stabilized the system. It anchored hierarchy. It justified authority. And most importantly, it prevented the return of expansive awareness, because fear and awareness cannot fully coexist. One contracts, the other expands. Fear was never meant to destroy humanity. It was meant to contain it. As fear embedded itself into the structure of reality, the human mind underwent a profound fracture. Ancient traditions speak of a time when perception was unified, thought, emotion, intuition, and bodily awareness functioning as a single continuum. After the shift, these faculties separated. What emerged was not a stronger mind, but a divided one. Logic was elevated above intuition. Emotion was treated as interference. The body was viewed as inferior to the mind. Spiritual perception was isolated from daily experience. This fragmentation produced an internal conflict that modern humans experience as normal, but ancient humans would have recognized as dysfunction. A fractured mind struggles to feel whole. It seeks completion externally, through achievement, consumption, identity, and validation. Satisfaction becomes temporary. Desire becomes endless. This is not a failure of character, but a symptom of division. When inner coherence is lost, the mind compensates through attachment. Fragmentation also altered identity. Humans began defining themselves by roles, beliefs, professions, and ideologies, rather than direct experience. Identity became conceptual rather than lived. This made the self fragile, because concepts require constant reinforcement. Threaten the concept, and the individual feels threatened. Ancient texts warn that a divided mind is easily governed, not because it is weak, but because it is conflicted. It hesitates, it doubts, it seeks certainty from outside rather than coherence within. This fracture did not eliminate awareness. It buried it beneath layers of mental noise. And over generations, humans forgot that another way of being had ever existed. Fragmentation became normal. Normal became invisible. And invisibility became permanence. One of the most effective illusions ever embedded into human perception is the belief that history moves forward in a straight line. Ancient civilizations did not see time this way. To them, history was cyclical, patterns repeating at different scales, rises followed by collapses, awakenings followed by forgetfulness. Linear time was not a natural perception. It was a constructed one. When history is perceived as linear, each generation believes itself separate from the past. Lessons are forgotten. Errors are repeated without recognition. Cyclical awareness, on the other hand, allows pattern recognition. It reveals that events are not random, but echoes. The same dynamics replay under different names, technologies, and narratives. Ancient calendars encoded this understanding. Civilizations tracked long cycles of rise and decline, often associated with cosmic movements. These were not superstitions. They were symbolic models of collective consciousness. When awareness expands, societies flourish. When it contracts, control intensifies. The linear model severed humanity from this insight. Progress replaced wisdom. Speed replaced depth. Humanity became obsessed with newness while unknowingly reenacting ancient dramas. Empires rose believing they were unprecedented, only to collapse following familiar trajectories. Seeing history as a loop threatens systems of control. A population that recognizes cycles becomes harder to deceive. It no longer believes promises of permanent salvation or permanent catastrophe. It understands that every structure has a lifespan and that consciousness always seeks balance. The loop does not trap humanity. Ignorance of the loop does. If fear stabilizes control and fragmentation weakens resistance, attention becomes the final battleground. Consciousness flows where attention goes. Ancient traditions understood this deeply. To control attention is to control experience itself. Modern systems did not invent distraction. They perfected it. Ancient rulers used ritual, spectacle, and myth to guide collective focus. Today, attention is fragmented continuously. The mind is pulled outward, interrupted, stimulated, exhausted. A distracted consciousness cannot reflect. It reacts. Attention, fragmentation, prevents integration. It keeps awareness shallow, constantly shifting, never settling long enough to perceive underlying structures. This is why silence feels uncomfortable. Stillness threatens the system. Quiet mind begins to see patterns, begins to reconnect. Ancient texts warned of this. They spoke of noise not as sound, but as mental disturbance. A noisy mind cannot hear truth. Control of attention ensures that even without overt oppression, consciousness remains confined. This is not accidental. Systems that rely on predictability require minds that do not wander too far inward. Attention is steered toward conflict, identity, fear, and consumption, rarely toward direct awareness. Attention is currency. Where it is spent determines reality. Despite the narrowing of awareness, not all knowledge was lost. Some was preserved. Quietly, selectively, and often at great risk. Throughout history, small groups recognized the danger of mass awakening under unstable systems. They chose preservation over propagation. These preservers encoded knowledge symbolically. Architecture, myth, geometry, ritual, and art became vessels. Information was hidden in plain sight, accessible only to those who learned how to see. This was not elitism. It was protection. Knowledge in the wrong psychological context becomes destructive. Initiation traditions emerged not to grant power, but to ensure readiness. Awareness expands safely only when the mind can integrate it. Sudden expansion without grounding leads to fear, delusion, or collapse. These hidden streams persist today. They are not conspiracies. They are continuities. Their goal was never domination, but continuity, keeping the flame alive until conditions allowed wider understanding. What survives is not information. It is orientation. Every system built on narrowed awareness perceives awakening as instability. Not because awakening destroys systems, but because it reveals their limitations. A conscious individual cannot be governed through fear alone. They require meaning, coherence, and truth. Awakening does not mean rebellion. It means clarity. And clarity dissolves illusions without violence. This is why awakened individuals throughout history were labeled dangerous. Not for what they did, but for what they saw. Systems respond predictably. Awakening is reframed as madness, heresy, or irresponsibility. The awakened are isolated, marginalized, or mythologized. Their insights are preserved as stories rather than lived practices. Yet awakening always returns. It is cyclical, like history itself. Awareness contracts, expands, and contracts again. The threat is never permanent. Awakening does not overthrow. It outgrows. Breaking the cycle does not require destruction of systems. It requires integration of awareness. The goal is not to return to a mythical past, but to recover range, to perceive without fragmentation, fear, or dependency. This begins with attention, with stillness, with the recognition that awareness is not something gained, but something remembered. Consciousness does not need to be expanded. It needs to be allowed. The cycle ends when individuals no longer seek authority outside themselves, when fear loses its grip, when identity becomes fluid rather than rigid. This is not utopian. It is gradual, internal, and quiet. Cycles do not end with revolution. They end with recognition, and recognition begins now.